Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Peries, coming to you from Baltimore. Greek default and exit is under serious consideration, according to sources close to the Syriza government. The Telegraph reported that 30-some Greek MPs have signed on to a plan that is similar to the Icelandic option. Joining me now to give us an update and analyze the current options on the table is Dimitri Lascaris. He's joining us from Toronto. Dimitri is a partner with the Canadian law firm Siskins, where he heads the firm's securities class action practice. Also joining us from Toronto is Leo Panitch. Leo is a distinguished research professor of political science at York University in Toronto. He's the author of the UK Deutsche Book Prize for the Making of Global Capitalism, the Political Economy of American Empire. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Sharmini.
Hi, Sharmini.
So, Dimitri, let me start with you. Give us an update of what's happening now.
Well, I understand that yesterday or over the weekend, Syriza sent a contingent of senior officials to Brussels to negotiate with the creditors to make one last-ditch attempt, that's the way it was characterized, to try to come to an agreement that would see an extension of the bailout program and the release of some 7 billion euros in funds to Greece. The reports are that the meeting, however, did not last more than 45 minutes because it became immediately apparent to those who were there to represent the creditors that the gap between the two sides remained too large. And the two sticking points appeared to be a demand that the VAT be increased significantly and that there be pension reform, which is really a euphemistic term for slashing of pension benefits. So the talks collapsed and the parties returned to their respective homes. And it appears that for the time being, there is no meaningful discussion going on, although there seems to be some desire on both sides for a resumption of talks. Whether that will actually happen at this stage is unclear.
So, Leo, will this be forcing Greece into bankruptcy?
Well, in a certain sense, it's bankrupt, but, governments aren't the same as corporations, and we shouldn't use that term. I think that's the term that is used in order to frighten us away from being able to take a stand against global capitalism. I think what's important is that what the Greeks came with was actually published in the Greek newspaper Kathimerini, which is no left-wing newspaper. It's kind of the mainstream paper in Athens. And they published the 8-page document that came with. And what was very interesting, and it shows you this really is about a class struggle, is, there's this disagreement over what the primary surplus will be and how large it will be and how they're going to make it up. And as Dimitri says, some of the fight was about what the value-added tax rate would be, what would happen with pensions. But what the Syriza negotiators were coming with was an increase in the corporation's tax from 26 to 29%, and an additional 12% special tax that would be introduced. They were also introducing a new tax on luxury vehicles, including large yachts, which is a very big deal in Greece, but on helicopters and big cars and so on. Now, I'm saying this because part of the reaction we get is, what will you do with value-added tax on food, on pharmaceuticals, on theater, on books? That's what they're trying to get them to bend on. But what the Greeks are presenting, and I must say a very measured way, both what the policy itself would yield and then what it would yield with administrative changes, where they'd actually have to change how they collect taxes, make that more efficient. Shows you that within the realm of what the Troika, the institutions are asking for, it's largely not just a matter about amount. It's a matter of where different revenues are going to be had from. And this is a class struggle.
If I might add one thing, Leo, I absolutely agree with that. One item you mentioned from the proposal that Greece put on the table, which is quite consistent with what you're saying, is there was a proposal, as I understand it, to substantially decrease military spending.
That's right. Yes, I noticed that.
Right. And apparently the creditors were none too happy about that notion.
Yeah, they were going to close, I think, something like 20 bases. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is a rational proposal, given, Greece is not at war with anyone.
Yes, although, if they don't do what the institutions want, you can bet that the Turkish planes invading Greek airspace will become even more common than they have been. They can cause a lot of problems for them if the Americans give the Turks a wink to do this.
So, Dimitri, I opened this segment by talking about what the left wing of Syriza is talking about. They have tabled Icelandic option. What does that mean?
Well, they're talking about nationalizing the banking system and imposing capital controls. That'll be essential to prevent further capital flight. There's been a horrific capital flight from the country over the past few months. And the banking system has been reliant upon emergency liquidity assistance from the ECB. The ECB has been very gradually ratcheting up the level of ELA, or emergency liquidity assistance, that it was prepared to offer, sort of keeping Greece on a drip feed. If that's cut off, then the banking system would collapse, and the only way that the Greek government could continue to ensure the functioning of the financial system is by issuing new currency. So they're talking about taking over the banking system, imposing capital controls, and potentially issuing a new currency, and regaining some measure of sovereignty over monetary policy. This, of course, would precipitate, and Leo's talked about this in the past, and I think he's quite right about it, it would precipitate quite significant suffering in the short term. The question, for example, key imports would become dramatically more expensive. There would be rationing of important products upon which the population relies. The question is whether, in the longer term, Greece is going to be better off after that quite difficult shock that it would have to experience in a conversion to the drachma, and as you know, or whatever other currency it might adopt. And some within Syriza, the left platform in particular, led by people like Kostas Lapavitsas, have argued that in the longer term, Greece will be better off. The country's products and services will become significantly more competitive. There would be significant increases in GDP, something along the lines of what was witnessed in Argentina when it departed from the peg to the U.S. currency and defaulted on its debt. Others are skeptical that Greece can experience the kind of economic recovery that Argentina and that Iceland experienced when they defaulted. I happen to be in the camp that believes that in the longer term, Greece will be better off. The primary budget surpluses that are being demanded by the creditors of Greece, in particular 3.5% from 2018 to 2022, would effectively asphyxiate the Greek economy, result in further contraction, and probably result in an increase in unemployment levels, and they're already at a staggering 26.6%. So from my perspective, the best prospect for Greece, although it would admittedly entail short-term suffering for the population, is a default and an exit from the Eurozone.
Leo, your take on what's going on?
Well, I think we should be realistic. I think, for good or ill, that the government is not contemplating this. I think that, and maybe that's for ill. You may find 30 Syriza MPs who are pushing this, but it's my impression still that the government doesn't have a plan B, that they put all of their eggs in the basket of figuring out what to do. Walter Munshaw in the Financial Times today, who's one of their leading columnists, calls for Greece to default on its debt completely, on all of the debt that it owes to public institutions, the IMF and all the European governments. They shouldn't default on its private debt because that would make it easier for it to get back into the bond market. He says exactly what Dimitri was just saying in terms of the consequences of continuing and even worsening this austerity. And in a banner headline across the top of the Financial Times, although the Financial Times itself doesn't take this position at all, he's only a columnist, he calls for this. And then it becomes unclear if they were to do this, starting with not paying the IMF at the end of June, and then not paying the Europeans what is owed in July. If they start doing this, then Europe has the question of what it does. there'd be, I think Dimitri's right, there'd be further pressure on bank deposits in Greece. Almost all the corporations and rich people have taken their money out, but relatively middle and even small-sized depositors are also taking money out and will do so even more. In that case, it depends what Europe would do. Would they expel them? Would they, as with Cyprus, have them agree and help them introduce capital controls? And that's not yet clear. The United States doesn't want Greece out of Europe for geostrategic reasons. And a good many Europeans won't want them out for those kinds of reasons. I think there are arguments inside each European state around this. What is tragic, if I may say, and really, really disturbing, is that in Germany, the head of the Social Democratic Party today, in the newspaper The Bild, said the following: Europe and Germany will not let themselves be blackmailed, and we will not let the exaggerated electoral pledges of a partly communist government be paid for by German workers and their families. Now, this comes 101 years after the German Social Democratic Party broke with internationalism, which it had been committed to its whole life, and joined its ruling class in World War I. And to see 101 years later, the leader of the German Social Democratic Party say this in the middle of this crisis makes one sick to one's stomach. I think there are probably more friends of Greece, ironically, elsewhere in Merkel's cabinet, maybe even Merkel herself, than she's finding from the Social Democrats, which is absolutely appalling.
And unfortunately, that's something you're seeing across the Eurozone. You're in Dijsselbloem, the Dutch.
Scandinavia, absolutely.
He's a carbon copy of Tony Blair, that adopted the third way some time ago, and has become a spokesperson for German neoliberalism. And you're seeing this in France, François Hollande. So in the social democratic movement within the European Union, unfortunately, Greece is not finding any allies at the moment.
No. And it's partly because Syriza comes along and says, we're going to increase the corporate rate of tax. We're going to introduce a 12% tax on the corporations. That's a one-off tax. We're going to close military bases, as you said. So it's not just a matter of the example of do you pay back your debt or not. It's also a matter of, what is your policy in terms of the class struggle in your own country.
Leo, let's take this up. You said earlier that there is no plan B. And at this time...
I don't know this for a fact, but people I talked to, I was shocked. Very senior people who've been involved in the negotiations. When I pressed them, it was pretty clear that everything that they were thinking about was the next strategy in the negotiations, not what would happen when they fail.
Right. So in the meantime, there's some 400 million euros in capital flight on a daily basis. Now, when I look at the Icelandic model, I understand that one of the things that they did was take over the three major banks in the country. And is that an option, a viable option?
If you're asking me, the banks are effectively nationalized. They're totally dependent on the central bank. Of course, you can take them over, but there's not anything they're doing that is getting in the way of anything. When the central bank is able, when the European Central Bank lets them sell treasury bills, they sell them to the Greek banks. There's not some problem that exists with the owners of the Greek banks that this is going to change. You might change, who the head of the Greek central bank is, but that's a public institution, and you probably should change.
That's an institution.
You should change who that is.
That's an institution that's under the control of the ECB. It is no longer under the control of the government.
Yeah, but the Greek government appoints who the head of the central bank is in Greece, and and that would have more effect than taking over the banks. But yeah, of course, I'm in favor of taking over the banks. I just don't think one should have any illusions. That is the problem. That is not the problem. It could well be that they would renege on the debt, and the European Central Bank will continue to allow the Greek banks to bumble on in the way that they're doing now, because they don't want Greece to leave. I mean, my greatest fear, in a way, is that this is not going to end, that we are not actually facing endgame. Even if some default occurs, the Europeans will still find some way to keep dribbling, exactly as Dimitri said, little bits of things to them that'll keep them in these bloody negotiations for another 4 months, another 9 months, etc., and not allow a break and a creative reconstruction of the economy to take place.
That's some has phrased, I believe, extend and pretend. Now, getting back to the Icelandic model, apparently the IMF had stepped in with a $5 billion rescue package, although Iceland was in debt itself to the IMF. Now, isn't that a more viable thing for the Troika to do? Let me ask you, Dimitri.
It did. It was 5 billion euros, which was a massive amount of money relative to the GDP of Iceland. And there's no doubt that that played a critical role in the success of the measures adopted by the government of Iceland. And there's a real question about whether the IMF or other international institutions, Europe, would come forward and provide Greece with that level or a comparable level of assistance were it to default and return to its own currency. I think what we ought to bear in mind, and Leo touched upon this at the outset of this discussion, which is that Greece has a peculiar geostrategic significance, both to Western Europe and to the United States, which was not true of Iceland and it was not true of Argentina. Watching Greece deteriorate into a failed state and potentially fall within the political orbit of other countries that are currently perceived to be hostile to the West, for example, Russia or China, is a very unpalatable outcome for the U.S. government and the EU. So they have a significant incentive to ensure that Greece does not become a failed state, an incentive which didn't exist in the case of Iceland. That doesn't provide a guarantee, of course, that they will provide the requisite degree of support as Greece transitions to its own currency. But it certainly suggests that they'll step into the breach and do what is necessary, minimally necessary, to ensure that Greece does not become a failed state.
I'd also point out that what was happening in Iceland was that the Icelandic banks had been involved in lending throughout Europe. Therefore, when the collapse occurred, it was endangering financial institutions outside. That's why the IMF acted. In the Greek case, what happened was that effectively Greece, under the previous reactionary governments, including the Social Democratic one, took on public debt in order to bail out the French and German banks. So they're not worried about the cascade. They're a little bit worried about what effect this will have, but they're not enormously worried about a cascading crisis, as was the case in Iceland. I think Dimitri's right that they're more worried about right now about the geostrategic implications than the economic ones. I have to say, I was on a panel last March with the Icelandic finance minister. He's no longer Icelandic finance minister. He was a Green Party politician. And that progressive government was defeated in Iceland, one needs to remember, in the last elections. But Syriza brought, or at least the Poulantzas Institute, which is the research institute of Syriza, brought him to a conference and had him on a panel with Dragisakis, who's now deputy prime minister, was then going to be finance minister, because they were interested in and wanted what the Icelanders did, and moreover wanted to get the visibility inside Greece that these things can be dealt with. You can have a radical government that tries to do with this. I wish there was more evidence that they are following the Icelandic model. I don't know that there is. At least I didn't see it when I was in Greece.
And that's
really where their minds are.
It's absolutely critical. I mean, there's a very interesting post today in the Naked Capitalism blog of Eve Smith by a gentleman whose name is Nathan Tankis. And he discusses in quite extensive detail the practicalities of a conversion to a new currency in the current circumstances. And it is a mammoth Herculean task.
Very difficult.
It requires extraordinary preparation and thinking and testing and retesting. And if in fact, the Greek government might have done an extraordinary job of keeping all of this under wraps, but that would be very surprising. It does appear that they haven't seriously invested resources in preparing for this eventuality, which heightens the risk that the suffering of the population would be extraordinary if Greece were to try to exit the Eurozone at this time. And so, one of the things that has to occur is a real focus for a significant period of time on this quite complicated task of converting back to a sovereign currency. And that doesn't appear to be going on.
No, and there's no time once you do it. I mean, the point is that this all, has to be done immediately once you do it. It came out 3-4 years ago at the time of another G7 meeting that the only people who had expertise on how to convert to the drachma and had actually developed a plan for it, I hope you're glad you're sitting down, was the IMF. And that's not surprising because they've got that kind of expertise. It's not even clear that Greece has the ability any longer to actually print drachma. There's not a mint any longer that's operating. That would have to be contracted out somewhere. And where would it be contracted? This is all, So, it's very easy. I think we need to be very modest. It's very easy to throw up, you could do this, you could do that. But when you're sitting there facing all of these practical difficulties, that is it's a bit overwhelming. And it would be overwhelming for any of us.
Dimitri, last week we speculated that Greek financial crisis and what Syriza should do about it was creating a split within Syriza. But this new plan that's being referred to might be a unifying force, reported some sources. Your thoughts on that?
Ambrose Evans Pritchard of The Telegraph, who's been quite sympathetic to the Greek government, he's a renowned Eurosceptic and a prolific writer on economic matters in the Eurozone. He reports that he has sources within Syriza who say that the intransigence and the extremism of the creditors, and that's, I think, quite a fair description of the positions they've taken, have created greater unity than ever within the party, that there is a greater appetite now for this eventuality, everybody recognizing the difficulties that it will precipitate. I think there probably is some truth to that. It would be very surprising if within Syriza there hadn't been a greater unity of purpose emerging from the intransigence of the creditors. One must recall that they have bent over backwards. I mean, when you commit to a primary budget surplus of 3.5% over a 4 to 5 year period in a depressionary economy, that's an extraordinary compromise. When you're talking about delaying increases in the minimum wage, Greece is the only country in the Eurozone to have experienced a decrease in the minimum wage since 2008. And they've expressed a willingness to delay any increases in the minimum wage for some significant period of time. So these are the types of compromises Syriza has come forward with, and they've been met with no repeatedly. And I imagine that has caused some persons who might have been more reticent previously in regard to the Grexit option to feel somewhat more sympathetic to that course of action. But at the end of the day, that course of action will require extraordinary preparation.
Last word to you, Leo.
Well, the other side of that is that as of last week, at least, there were many in the party who thought that the government would sign a bad agreement. And that would lead the party to implode. And it might. And that's part of what, of course, is going on here, that the leadership, which I still think remains fully committed to Europe, and will not quite know what to do if they're pushed out. And I don't think they will leave. I think that they might renege on the debt and then say to the Europeans, what are you going to do to us? But, I think that I had the sense from people inside the party, very senior people, that there would be an implosion if they became a semi-progressive government trying to manage a very bad agreement, that the party would implode. So I think this is not necessarily contradicting what Dimitri's just said. I think, the more that they stand up, not just in the sense of, refusing to do what they're being asked to do in this latest round, but actually putting forward things like closing bases and increasing taxes on corporations and so on, that builds a unity in the party.
Dimitri Lascaris, Leo Panitch, both of you joining us from Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sharmini.
And for those of you who want to follow this discussion, The Real News will be having an event on the 29th in Toronto, right at the corner of Markham and Bloor Street. If you're interested, please contact us at contact@therealnewsnetwork. Thank you.